This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. Most of us are familiar with the plastic waste crisis and public awareness campaigns on the need to recycle plastic. Now, a new report by the Center for Climate Integrity, an international non-profit, says that plastic producers have been lying to the public for more than 30 years. It says that they knew all along that plastic recycling was not a viable solution at all, either technically or economically, and yet they kept promoting it to protect their own interests. So, how serious is the plastic waste problem today? And why is plastic recycling not viable? And if recycling is not the answer, how do we address the mounting crisis of plastic waste around the globe? We discuss all these questions in great detail in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Satyarupa Shekhar, a public policy advocate whose interests include urban governance, data justice, and plastics pollution. Satyarupa, welcome to In Focus, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sampath. Thanks for having me.
So, to start with, I was wondering, plastic waste is generally seen as a subset of the global solid waste problem. So, can you just give us a quick overview of the real magnitude of this plastic waste crisis? How serious is it, in your opinion?
So, the plastic pollution crisis is something that we cannot ignore any longer. The world creates about 460 metric tons of plastic, and more than 350 metric tons of this ends up as plastic waste. Plastics has a direct impact on climate. One estimate is that about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions are directly related to plastic production processes. So what we are seeing is actually the plastic crisis is enormous in its magnitude, not just in the climate in the greenhouse gas emissions, but also in the ability of the planet to manage this. So one of the ways in which plastic hampers, the planetary processes is that it impedes the ability of oceans, which are currently the most significant carbon sink. It impedes the ability of oceans to sequester carbon. It has enormous impacts on wildlife, which ingest plastic, and of course, it is undeniable the science that human beings are ingesting, inhaling plastics, and the skin is able to even absorb nanoparticles.
Right. I mean, human beings are able to inhale. How does it happen? How do we inhale plastic?
So there's a lot of microplastics and nanoplastics in the air. It's in our water. It's in our food. So you'd be shocked to know that sugar, salt, honey, even beer has tiny, particles of plastic. There are some; these are mostly unintentionally added. They sort of contaminate our food systems, but also there are intentionally added plastics. So, for example, some of our toothpaste, our detergents, actually contain these small granules, which are marketed to us as exfoliators or dirt busters. And all of this, we sort of unknowingly and unwittingly we fall for these marketing schemes, and then we ingest these things.
And they have harmful effects on our health and so on.
Absolutely. So basically, plastics are fossil fuels. 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels, and this is oil, gas, and coal. And what we are seeing is that to make plastics, you need several kinds of chemicals. The latest estimate is that there are 16,000 chemicals that are added to make plastics. And these chemicals are important or necessary to make the plastics because that is what gives it, the shape or properties like for color or even flame retardants. Now, these chemicals, many of them have already been established to have major health impacts. Many of them are carcinogenic. In fact, very recently there has been an article or an expose on a specific chemical called 1.4 dioxane. And this is actually used in the production of polyester, so a lot of our clothes, for example, and as well as PET. And PET is something that is used typically for beverage bottles. Now, it's not in these products, but it's used to produce these products, and then it remains, right? So when we are using many of these products, we are actually ingesting these chemicals. And some of the health impacts that have already been sort of linked to this are cancers, reproductive health problems. So, people are experiencing already infertility and miscarriages. There are hormonal disruptions, caused by endocrine disruptors, and a whole host of gastrointestinal and respiratory illnesses.
Right. I mean, thank you for explaining the seriousness of plastic consumption and ingestion, and with regard to the human health, Satyarupa. I was just wondering, there is also a lot of food grade plastic, as they say, which they produce, which is promoted as not harmful at all. So, like for water bottles and so on. So, what do you have to say about this food grade plastic, quote unquote? Is that safe?
Well, I guess one would say they are relatively safer than some of the other kinds of plastics, but they're not entirely safe. So polystyrene, which is basically, what we call typically thermocol or styrofoam, in which a lot of hot food is served. It basically leaches a lot of the chemicals into the food. Hot food, of course, is worse. It gets impacted even worse. Plastics also react to a lot of the oils and masalas that we have. So we are seeing that the chemicals then leach into our food, into our water, and even when they are disposed, whether it's in an open dump site or in a cement kiln or in an incinerator, these chemicals tend to stay on. They leach into our water, into the air, and into the soil. And from that, we then see it coming back into our food system. So, for example, mulch sheets that are used for agriculture practices, those are very hard to retrieve. And what happens is that they disintegrate very quickly and are just sort of plowed back into the soil. There are some recent scientific studies that show that plants and fruits and vegetables are able to actually absorb a lot of these chemicals through their roots. Things that we consider very healthy to eat, like apples and carrots, actually are already absorbing a lot of these chemicals. And of course, we have absorbed, a lot of these chemicals from that. There's also evidence that plastics are, and the chemicals in plastics are affecting whether they're chicken or fish. There's this entire web, and then there's a persistence that remains. This is called bioaccumulation. It basically just remains in the food systems, and then we are perpetuating the impacts. Some of these impacts actually are already established to be even intergenerational, which means today, as a woman in a reproductive age, I could be exposing a child or even the child's child.
Right. I mean, that really is quite concerning, if not outright scary, especially, intergenerational aspect you just mentioned. Now, going on to the other side of this entire subject, Satyarupa, this question of disposal. Recycling has been promoted as the key solution to disposing of plastic waste, so to speak. But now it turns out that it isn't the solution it was made out to be. Can you talk a little bit about why recycling plastic is not viable anymore? Why is it? Well, maybe it was never viable, and we were lied to. But what is the issue with recycling plastic?
So you're absolutely right, Sampath. We've been always lied to. And the perpetuation of this myth, what we're calling the recycling myth, this has been perpetuated by the petrochemical companies, the oil and gas companies, and other companies within the plastics industry. This is a concerted effort by most of the major both the petrochemical industry basically since the 1950s. And this can be really traced back to the US, where they've undertaken systematic efforts to create a public perception that plastics are recyclable. Moreover, they've undermined legislations. There have been some attempts to bring in progressive legislations like bans or even elimination of certain materials. These have been undermined, and many city governments in the U.S. were forced to withdraw or dilute these legislations. Very close to home in India, we are seeing a lot of dilutions in some progressive legislations. So, for example, the solid waste management rules, or very specifically the plastic waste management rules, had a clause that said that, in 2016, the clause said that, multi-layered packaging, which is basically sachets and various kinds of flexibles, would be eliminated by 2018. But thanks to a lot of the industry lobbying, what we're seeing is that the 2018 amendment of this legislation basically said that energy recovery is an acceptable method of disposal, and energy recovery basically they've gone further to say that waste to energy or incineration, which means basically you can burn it in a cement kiln or a waste to energy plant or an incinerator, and that is acceptable as recycling. So what we're seeing is basically the changes in definitions that are perpetuating this myth. And behind this is basically the industry that has been undertaking decades of campaigns to influence, both consumer perception as well as the information that policymakers have. What we are seeing is that the industry has also restricted information about what kinds of chemicals go into making plastics. And this is why over the past 2 years or so, we are seeing that the estimates of what kinds of chemicals are actually present and used in plastic has been increasing. So it started with about 10,000 chemicals in 2021 or 22, and then it has now come to 16,000 chemicals as of November 2023. This means that the onus of actually identifying what kinds of chemicals are being used lies on scientists, really, rather than the industry that is actually making the active decision to make those kinds of plastics and to use certain kinds of chemicals to make those plastics.
Right. I mean, uh, you spoke about this incineration as something which is sort of reclassified as recycling. Now, forget about how we understand incineration as a solution to this plastic waste problem. But assuming we call it as incineration and not consider it as recycling, is that a way forward in terms of eliminating plastic waste? Is that a viable solution? This waste to energy option, as it were.
So waste to energy is basically, the process of it's basically burning plastic. But burning plastic that's been made from fossil fuel and saying that that would be better for the climate than burning any other kinds of fossil fuels is really a fairly absurd idea, right? If you just burn something that's been made from fossil fuels, we are going to be adding to the greenhouse gases and impacting the climate. But what is worse is that the plastics actually contain a lot of these other chemicals that are then released into the air, water, and soil, as I said. Not it's not just a problem of the definition of recycling, but it's actually technically and economically not feasible. And this is something that the industry has found out for themselves since the 1950s or even earlier. What the problem is that you need exactly the same kinds of polymers to be processed together, whether it's mechanical recycling or what the industry calls advanced recycling, which is basically chemical recycling. You need the same kinds of plastics. Even a change in the color of plastics impacts or lowers the ability of the plastic to get recycled, right? So, for example, you cannot recycle a PET bottle along with a sachet, a multi-layered package, right? A plastic package. These have to be extremely well sorted out, down to the material, to the color, etc. These cannot be contaminated by, say, food items or any other sort of oil or grease, etc. So it's technically actually also sort of just unviable and economically unfeasible as well. We are seeing a lot of announcements, and we have been seeing for decades the same industries making announcements of setting up recycling units. There are several articles by the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives or even Greenpeace International that have actually undertaken an investigation of how many incinerators are actually operational and even sort of doing any form of recycling. One of the best examples of the failure of such an effort, I would say, is Unilever's Creosolve project in Indonesia, where they claimed that they were going to recycle sachets, which are multi-layered plastic packaging. And they basically use, Unilever uses sachets all across Asia to sell anything from shampoos to sauces to face creams, etc. And after, billions of dollars, they quietly closed that project in Indonesia. And it's basically been declared a failure, right? So it's the industry's own narrative that recycling actually does not work.
Right. I mean, thank you for explaining this whole incinerator slash recycling debate in some detail, Satyarupa. I was just wondering, but even so, we keep hearing from now on, time and again, some data being put out saying X percentage of plastic which is produced is recycled, and you do get, like, branded advertisements saying this is made from recycled plastic and all. So there has been some recycling which has been happening, right? I mean, whether rightly or wrongly, we do get recycled plastic in our way. So, like, what happens to this recycled plastic? Like, like, so is there some kind of headway being made in terms of a solution with plastic, which is nonetheless being recycled?
So since the 1950s, of all of the plastic that has been created, I think the best estimate is that 9% has been recycled as of date. And for a country like the US, where a lot more money has been spent on quote unquote recycling plastic packaging, this estimate has been revised down to 5 to 6%. Right. So what we are seeing is actually the industry conflating words like recycled, recycling, recyclable, right? And one may say that these are just semantics, but this is where I think the deception really lies. Calling something recyclable is not the same thing as saying that this has been recycled or that recycled material has been used for making something. That's the numbers. The other is, what do we really call recycling? There is a European Union directive that says that recycling really is if the material or if the product can be made into a material that is then used to make the same product, right? Which means that, for example, a PET bottle would be then made back into a PET bottle. However, what we are seeing in general is that a PET bottle is then made into polyester yarn, which is then made into a carpet. And that is not called recycling. Really, that is downcycling. And even so, even if you count all of that in, we're still saying that only 9% of the total plastics has really been recycled. All of the rest is either lying in our oceans or in our landfills, or about, I think, 20%, I think that's the statistic, 20 to 20%, 22%, sorry, has been incinerated. So, that I think the numbers basically speak for itself. All of the others, I think, are very deceptive, communications campaigns. And one only really needs to look at the annual financial statements of many of these companies to see that their PR budget or their marketing budget far, far outweighs how much they're spending on research and development. Even if any one of these companies was really serious to set up a recycling unit or even transition to a reuse system, the numbers actually, the money, they're not putting the money where the mouth is.
Right. I mean, 5% or 9% of plastics getting recycled is really, I mean, astounding to hear
Absolutely.
that figure. Yeah. Uh, yeah. And I was also wondering, Satyarapa, so you were talking about this recycling versus downcycling. I mean, I didn't know this distinction. I mean, I had assumed that recycling of plastic would mean that it is getting used in some way again. So the distinction between, say, a PET bottle getting made into a yarn, as you said, to make carpets, versus PET bottle getting made into a PET bottle again. I mean, this kind of distinction, I think not many people know about it. So let's say I buy, when we travel, a lot these days, everybody does. So you buy a Bisleri bottle or some mineral water bottle, and then you finish it off, and then that bottle which you throw into the bin. Or you keep it away, and or you keep it with yourself, and then you give it to some recycling person or whatever. So what happens to that bottle really? A mineral water bottle. Everybody uses plastic mineral water bottles, and you throw it away. We assume it is getting recycled, right? But what really happens to it? Can you throw some light on that?
So basically, what's happening with a lot of this material is that our municipal systems are now sort of geared to collect and to transport it either to a landfill, or in some places there is some segregation that's happening. However, most of this in India, can be attributed to informal waste pickers, the informal waste sector that's actually collecting a lot of this. Unfortunately, and on a side note, we actually keep criminalizing waste pickers, and they continue to operate on the margins, both economically and socially. However, this material basically that they collect, they segregate. They have an incredible, knowledge that they've established of or and developed over years and decades of what kinds of plastic. All of this then keeps getting aggregated. It's taken to certain kinds of quote unquote recyclers, because I think the process of recycling is something that is still also happening a lot. A lot of that is happening informally. What happens is a lot of this is put through some form of thermal treatment, and it's either pressed into, say, bricks or pavement blocks or boards that are used to make various kinds of either buildings or desks, etc. Right, and these are being promoted by Unilever, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, in partnership with UNDP in India, for example. Something like PET bottles, which has a higher value. The higher value is because there is a certain demand for this product, right? So it goes into, say, a textile factory. It goes into making yarn, and there are some, I think, claims, and I personally am not sure how to verify these. They are being used to make, say, sports shoes or outdoor, gear. And mostly carpets or astroturf, right? This is very few sort of examples. We really don't know how much they are operating on scale. However, what we do know are all sorts of other examples that are being promoted and pushed as recycled, right? So, what we are seeing is the government of India and various state governments saying that plastic roads is a form of recycling, which is basically what they're saying is that they sort of add that into the bitumen, they melt it to a certain degree, and then they use it to make roads. But how many such kilometers really exist in India, let alone the world? Right? Plastic to fuel is very obvious. If you burn something that's been made from fossil fuels, you'll get fossil fuels, but you'll also get all of the chemicals that went into it. So I think all of this is actually being clubbed as recycling, and I think there's very little evidence to show either scale or replicability.
Right, scale and replicability. I think two really good litmus tests we can apply to this entire recycling claim that we've been talking about. Now, you also spoke a little bit about the greenhouse gas emissions aspect of this whole problem. When plastics are part of the petrochemical industry, I mean, they come from fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly is the link between plastic production and waste and climate change, because climate change is the big global issue today, and what exactly is the nature of the relationship between these two?
Right. So, plastic is basically made from fossil fuels and a whole bunch of other chemicals, which are also, many of which are also coming from the same petrochemical industry. What we're seeing is that plastics, even though they begin as fossil fuel, they are emitting greenhouse gases at each stage of that of its lifespan, or actually what we should be calling a death cycle. Right from the fossil fuel extraction and the transport of the fossil fuels, we're seeing greenhouse gas emissions. Plastic, the polymerization, the refining and manufacture of plastics, we have lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Managing plastic waste, whether it's through incineration or whether they're disposed and leak into our environment, with whether it's oceans, waterways, or in a landscape, all of that has greenhouse gas contributions. And these sort of gas emissions, many of which are very hard to estimate, right? But we basically have some estimates that, in 2019 alone, the production and incineration of plastics was about 850 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. And this is now equivalent to 189 coal power plants of 500 megawatts, right? This is the scale at which we're talking about the greenhouse gas emissions from plastics alone.
Right. I mean, that is indeed a staggering number. So, given that this is the magnitude of the impact on climate which plastic production and waste generation has, which are the industries or use cases that are the leading producers of plastic waste? Because I think they would need to be held accountable for this.
Absolutely. So packaging accounts for 36% by some estimates, and I think this is a 2019 estimate or 2020 estimate. So one can say that this is it might have increased. Textiles account for about 15% of all the plastics used. Building and construction accounts for 16%. And this is something that we're really not aware of, is how much plastics actually goes into building and construction. We of course have all of these electrical switches, etc., but also we're talking about insulation, whether it's thermal insulation, acoustic insulation, PVC pipes. Right, PVC is the worst form of plastic. All of these chlorides that are added are extremely harmful. It's a very harmful body of chemicals, group of chemicals. So these are primarily the top, well, I would say the top three sectors: packaging, construction, and textiles. We also have consumer products that account for about 10%. And then we have electronics, transportation, etc., etc. Right? But really, it's packaging, and mostly it's single use packaging. So we're talking about products that have been designed to be intentionally used only once, whether it's a PET bottle, whether it's a chips packet. These are designed to be used only once. It's a different matter that some of us have been using the same plastic bottle multiple times, but they're not designed by safety standards. They're not designed to be used more than once, actually. So if you see the labeling on that bottle, they always say dispose after use and usually crush so that it cannot be reused, right? So that's the labeling and that's the intent behind this. Within packaging, we are seeing that there are several problematic kinds of plastics as well. And I'd really like to draw attention specifically to sachets, because Asia is just sort of flooded with sachets by companies like Unilever and Nestle, but also Pepsi, which has Pepsi and Coca-Cola, ITC, Haldiram. And there are brand audits that we have been doing, a whole bunch of civil society groups have been doing, to draw attention to the problem of multi-layered packaging, very specifically, as an extremely unmanageable form of packaging. Right now, the problem with multi-layered packaging is that it is multiple layers of materials, not just the plastic, but it's also got a very thin aluminium foil, and it's got adhesives. Plus, it's got a whole bunch of colorants on it. And this is basically an entirely branding exercise, right? This is for companies to actually have a free, marketing where you can immediately see their brand. However, this is the worst kind of packaging, because it's very lightweight. It's designed to be use and throw, and really one cannot do anything about it.
Yeah, you mentioned that Asia in particular has got this huge number of sachets flooding everywhere. Is this like a bigger problem in Asia than in other continents? A sachet?
In Asia, primarily, because one is, of course, we have many of our countries have large populations, and we have huge markets. So many of these fast-moving consumer goods companies have found it, um, they've prioritized these markets. The same products, whether they're shampoos, Dove soap or Dove shampoo, if you look in the US or in the UK or Europe, they always come in HDP, rigid plastic bottles. And of course, there is a little bit more sort of innovation that they're trying to do around refill systems in Europe, for example. In Asia, however, they have chosen to market the same products in sachets. And this is now taking place in Europe and, in Africa as well as South America. Those markets are smaller than Asian markets. And so we are seeing that this is actually a huge problem for Asia. I also wanted to just sort of, draw attention to this whole narrative that many of these fast-moving consumer goods companies have spun that Asians and Asian countries have contributed to ocean plastic the most. So they've named China, India, Indonesia, Philippines as the biggest contributors to ocean plastic. And what we're actually seeing is that many of these companies are intentionally using packaging designs or formats and delivery systems that actually contribute to this. But not only these companies, but what we are seeing is many of these countries have been exporting their waste, their consumer waste, their municipal waste to our countries under the guise of being recycled. And as we know, this material cannot be recycled. It's just fortunate that we have civil society groups that are conducting exposés and alerting authorities to.
Does India import this kind of plastic waste from the West?
Well, there is evidence to show that this waste is coming in. Unfortunately, it's hard to track because there are Basel Convention norms that prohibit municipal waste from getting transported to our countries. However, there have been some exposés where people have installed GPS trackers in some of their waste. And those trackers have alerted us to waste leaving the shores of US or Europe and making the way to one expose was that it made its way to Indonesia, where alert authorities were able to repatriate that waste. And some of those ships actually docked in India, and they have made their way by road from I believe it was Gujarat, a port in Gujarat, to Uttar Pradesh, which is where then the tracker disappears.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So 36% of this waste coming from the packaging sector, 15% from textiles, 16 from building and construction, and almost 10% from consumer goods. I mean, this is like a huge number of very critical industries contributing to plastic waste. And I was just wondering, one final take from you on what is the way forward, because is there a way to sort of reduce the production of plastic waste by altering the way these industries function? Like, how are you going to uh, overnight come up with alternatives to plastic insulation? So has there been any thinking globally in terms of a roadmap, timeline, in terms of what kind of solutions, because we also have this entire climate change thing hanging over us, and the importance of reducing carbon emissions? So how do we tackle this entire plastic waste menace? Any thoughts on that going forward?
It's actually absolutely possible that we can transition from a fossil fuel based economy, of course, but also a plastic based economy. There are ongoing negotiations for a global plastic treaty, which would be an international legally binding instrument to deal with all kinds of plastic pollution. One of the top priorities would be for plastic production reduction, which basically means that we need to reduce the plastic polymers that we're creating. At the same time, we need to prioritize reuse systems, which means that we, set up, design our products, our packaging, as well as delivery systems to be reusable. And this needs to come from the producers and brand owners. Reuse is not a consumer oriented, or the onus should not lie on consumers, rather, it should be on producers. The third priority really needs to be about regulating chemicals of concern. Like I said, there are about 16,000 chemicals, and only 128 of these are globally regulated, which means that we have a whole bunch of other chemicals that many of which are hazardous, but are not regulated. So we need to regulate these, and associated with this, I think, is the need for transparency, of course. um, One more critical priority for treaty negotiations would be to identify and eliminate highly problematic, unnecessary, and avoidable plastic products and materials. So, of course, PVC and polystyrene would be the top two, I would suggest, but also sachets and other flexibles are plastic products that we can eliminate. There are, I think, several
Like if you were to eliminate PVC and sachets, for example, as completely dangerous and so on, what could be the alternatives? Because you spoke about the critical use of PVC pipes, and sachets is what is like the primary source of revenue for these Unilever kind of companies. So what are the alternatives? Like, has there been any talk on that?
I think there is research that exists on alternatives to PVC. So, for example, PVC pipes in the US, the Environment Protection Agency, US EPA, is now seriously considering the enormous health and environmental impacts of PVC and PVC pipes. And while some of this standard setting, etc., is going on, there are environmental groups that are talking about alternatives like steel or galvanized iron, or galvanized steel and cast iron, copper pipes, etc. Right? These are much more stable materials, and there's much more research done on the environmental and health impacts. So those things exist. I think you also mentioned, for example, insulation. Very interestingly, I've been speaking with somebody who works with pastoralist communities in India. India alone has 75 million sheep, and the sheep has a short staple. The wool is of short staple, and it is very much amenable to making insulation. It's excellent for making thermal and acoustic insulation. It can be used for some kinds of packaging. It can replace plastic mulch sheets because it's natural, it's biodegradable, it retains moisture. So those things exist. The reason why we don't use it is that we have subsidies that are artificially making plastics cheap, and petrochemical based plastics cheap, right? Alternatives already exist. We have a culture of reuse in India, across Asia. We just don't have policies that prevent, for example, restaurants, if they choose reuse. If I took my tiffin dabba to a restaurant, what is the liability that that they can expect? They don't have policy. The absence of policy prohibits the shift to reuse. So we really need reuse. We need standards, just as we have several standards for plastic and plastic regulation. I think encouraging reuse would require investment, would require a policy or regulatory regime, and we definitely require independent and indigenous science and knowledge.
Right. Thank you so much, Satyarupa, for that optimistic note at the end of a very concerning discussion. I think it's encouraging to note that the Global Plastics Treaty is underway, and there is talk of reducing plastic pollution, sort of coming forth with policy changes to increase reuse. And hopefully, we will see changes of this kind coming in more and more, so that we are able to tackle the big issue of climate change as well, and not just plastic pollution, which is also a major issue in its own right. Thank you so much once again for talking to us. It's been a very informative conversation for me particularly, and I'm sure for listeners as well. Absolute pleasure talking to you, Satyarupa. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Sampath. Thank you very much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.